Hi guys. For the discussion this week, I chose the topic of racism, which is obviously a super broad topic. But it was one of like the isms of social injustice for social work. And I just think it's a very important topic. And I'm taking a current social problems class, and I like love that class. It teaches me so much. And we've been talking about racism in that class, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to like kind of take what I've learned in that class and apply it to social work. Um, so why I chose this topic, I kind of just briefly talked about that, but also I feel like this is a very important topic to discuss in terms of social work. And I think it's important to realize that like it is an important part of social injustice, and that we like can all play a part in, you know, working to combat racism in our daily lives and everything like that. Okay, the first topic that I chose is called Trump and Allies Try to Redefine Racism by Casting White Men as Victims. Um, I thought this article was super interesting, kind of controversial, but it first of all talks about like the attack on the Capitol on January 6th and how that kind of brought this whole discussion about and everything like that. So it talks about how Trump and his allies used their own definition of racism when discussing this, and like the having like Black judges and everything like that judge the people from January 6th. And in making their own definition of racism, they disregarded the country's history of racial exclusion and the monopoly of white people on power and wealth, which I think is a very important like part of racism that a lot of people don't talk about. I mean, even in the chapter, like our social work reading, it talks about how there's individual racism and communal racism and everything like that, but there's also structural racism, which is like this aspect, which is like the monopoly of white people on power and wealth. Also, Trump and his allies claimed that America should aim to be more equitable, and thus white men should not be disadvantaged in any way. So they kind of painted white men as the victims for being disadvantaged in terms of trying to achieve equity, which I feel like is just very harmful to minority groups and people who have been marginalized for many years. They also had the sentiment that equity has gone too far, and that people are being punished for like randomly being born white, which is very not true as well, because we know about white privilege and how being born white is very beneficial to people in many different ways. And it kind of just like the reading in general just talks about a lot of people having different definitions of racism and, disregarding the effect that it has on, minority groups in their lives and how it affects literally every aspect of their lives. But this was obviously a very worldly view of like racism and social work and everything like that, because it like just focuses on like the politics of it as opposed to how people can work together to try to solve the problems of racism. Okay, and then the scholarly article that I found was called Talking About Race with Children. And it talked a lot about how like race is just embedded in our society, and it's a construct, but it is used to benefit people and it has real consequences. So like the first bullet point says, race has real consequences on people's lives, and it changes how we view ourselves as racial beings. This article talked about like talking to children about race, particularly Black children, and how when they're growing up, they are like taught from the get-go, like about race and how that affects them in their lives. I also talked about how race is deeply embedded in the institutions in which we all operate. I'm taking, that current social problems class, and we talk about how race is a part of all of our lives and every institution that we are a part of. And so like I've seen that that's true. There are also it talks about how conversations about race are necessary in multiple contexts, Even though it could be like uncomfortable, it's important to have those conversations. It also talks about how the construction of race the construction of race at the beginning of our nation was to advance the agenda of white men. And it particularly said white land-owning men, which is true, you know that. And also the importance of having open and honest conversations about race and racism as an essential part of parenting. This article gave a lot of different stories about parents and their children and teaching them about race. And she talked about how that was very important to like have vulnerable and uncomfortable conversations. But just to be open and honest, because like this is a real thing, and to have those conversations. Okay. For the code of ethics for this topic, I think social justice, probably the biggest one. I also think like the wealth and dignity of an individual is also important, but I feel like overall the most important one was social justice, because you know social workers should pursue social change. I think racism is one of the largest issues within our society, and that is something that we as social workers can pursue. Also, the Code of Ethics talks about how we're supposed to help vulnerable and oppressed individuals or groups of people. You know, racism is very important. And people of certain races are vulnerable and oppressed, and social workers should aim to help them. And also that social workers should like encourage knowledge about oppression and cultural and ethnic diversity, which I think relates to that last article that I talked about, you know, teaching children about racism from a young age and, you know, teaching them about diversity and everything like that. All right, now to compare and contrast the two articles. The first article was the news article from the Washington Post, and it was mostly like talked about what the white man's perspective on race was. And it kind of did that because that was the topic that it was talking about. It wasn't aiming to really just talk about the white man's perspective on race, but you know, talk about Donald Trump and his allies and the whole January 6th attack and how that affected their view on race. It also talked about more current social events. You know, talked about how we are talking about race in our modern day because of recent events. It also talked about more about like political parties on racism. So it talks about how like Republicans view racism, how Democrats view racism, and how like that affects like their voting and things like that. It talked a lot about voters and how they view race, which I thought was interesting. Just like how voters in their political parties view race. And then it also talks about how there are different definitions of racism for different groups. So like I said, like different political parties have different views on race, different races have different views on race. And it's just interesting to see how, you know, people will view racism the way that they want to view racism. On the other side, the scholarly article talks about the importance of teaching children about racism, and how like it's important to have those uncomfortable conversations. It also focuses on the identity of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, whereas the other article focuses mainly on white men and their perspective of racism. And then also it talks about how race influences the development of all children, which I think is a very important thing to realize, because in social work we know that, you know, children are affected by a lot of different things, but clearly race is one of these things that affects children, you know, affects their development and affects all children. In terms of similarities between the articles, they both reference the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The first one more directly, and then the second one just kind of talks about how, you know, that event shows how racism is deeply embedded in our society and how there is white privilege and how that affects people. Both articles also talked about the influence of race on every aspect of our lives, as well as they both talked about the importance of teaching about racism. Okay, now I'll go to my question, which is, How can social work be an important tool for combating racism in modern society? I feel like in this presentation I talked a lot about just racism in general, but obviously social work is an important tool for people who are struggling with, you know, being marginalized, being oppressed, everything like that. So, how do you think social work can be an important tool for these people? Here are my sources, and that is all for me. Thank you guys so much for listening. You guys have a great day. Oh my gosh, I can't end this. There we go. See ya, guys.